It was 1986, the year, and I was thinking about what will I write next. I was thinking about an idea, what's going to really get me, started, and something I'd be really interested in. And I started thinking about the idea of the story of the Titanic. And the reason I did was because I thought it's, in order to put something on the Broadway stage, you really want to have something of great import, something dramatic, some event of some kind. It could be a personal event, but it could also be a historical event. And I thought that story of the Titanic has fascinated the world ever since. It's it's probably, the word Titanic is regarded as being one of the 2 or 3 most recognized words in the world, because in every language, Titanic, everybody knows about it, and everybody knows the story. And so I thought, okay, well, that's great. That's universally interesting, universally regarded as something, a story of tragedy, a story of heroism, God knows what, but it's a fascinating story. And also, I thought, the center of that story is a tragedy. I understand that. Over 2,000 people died. So how is that going to be a Broadway show? I mean, Broadway shows seem to be intrinsically, or should be, optimistic. I'm just a girl who can't say no. Right? That's because everybody said, "Oh, you're crazy, man. What, are you crazy?" People are going to laugh out of the theater. And I said, I something about this story, and I thought, no, it seems to me that there's something there. And as I was thinking about it, in 1986, the space shuttle blew up right over my head, and 3 girls died. And I thought, wait a minute, what were they doing there? They were there to become part of our eternal search for human knowledge, understanding of our universe, understanding of our planet. They were out there questing for knowledge for all of us. Yes, it's the same story as Titanic, and yet it's elevated. And it's a story that happens again and again, and I thought, yeah, I want to tell this story. I don't care. I think it's negative. I also think it's incredibly aspirational and positive for what they strive for what we all strive for. And so I started writing it. And actually, the first thing I started writing was the opening. And you're supposed to write the opening last. Well, you're supposed to, because, as we like to teach in the BMI Music Theater Workshop, because how can you write the opening unless you know that to which you need to open?
Right.
However, that doesn't matter. If you have a sense of where my way in, you can always change it. But somehow I felt, how did they build Titanic? Near 1,000 sheep. Right away I wanted to, because the enormity of because it was the Industrial Revolution, the most advanced technological achievement of the human intellect in history. And of course, they would have had the courage and the fortitude and the ego to say, we have to have the biggest, the best, the strongest. And so that's a great, and the safest. And that was their aspiration. And so pride cometh before a fall. I thought, okay, we have to see what the want is, what the ask is, what the claim is, what the reason is that we're doing this. We're doing this to protect people. What could be a better project to do? And so I was off and running, and I had already written about 7 or 8 songs before I sat down with Peter and we started putting together the story.
I report the ship loaded and ready for sea.
Lower the gangways, Mr. Buell.
Gangways lowered, Captain.
And cross the tugs.
Tugs all fast, sir.
Let go all lines.
Let go the snow lines. Let go the bow lines. Let go off springs.
Over and over. Sing, Lord, sing. Fortune's ways. Sing, Lord, sing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Kirsch, and I'm the host of the theater podcast Backstage Babble, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this reunion of members of the Broadway cast and creative team of the musical Titanic. Titanic opened on April 23rd, 1997, with its staggering 37 cast members and 26 musicians, and played 804 performances, meanwhile winning all of the 5 Tonys it was nominated for, including Best Musical. Titanic tells the story of the legendary 1912 sinking of the ship that carried so many of America's elite, featuring real figures from that initial sailing as characters. In 2024, it's fair to say that we're experiencing a Titanic renaissance, and I don't just mean the fact that a replica of the original ship is about to set out on another landmark voyage, but that in the last 2 years alone, Titanic the musical has seen a successful London production that was broadcast internationally, scores of student productions, including recent ones at NYU and PPAS, and as a capper, the upcoming Encores revival featuring an all-star cast. So today I'm happy to be joined by 7 of the people without whose contributions the show would not be as beloved as it is today. Michael Cerveris, who played Thomas Andrews, John Bolton, who began in the role of Charles Lightoller and took over the role of Charles Clark, Alma Cuervo, who played the role of Ida Strauss, David Garrison, who took on the role of the infamous J. Bruce Ismay, Buell, who played Edgar Bean, Ted Sperling, who played several roles, including orchestra leader Wallace Hartley, and Lynne Taylor-Corbett, who choreographed the original production. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Charles.
Thanks for having us.
And I'd love to get started by asking how your journeys with Titanic began. And let's start with Lynne, as I assume she was involved first.
Oh, thank you. I actually met Richard Jones in London because there was interest. I was in Europe, and there was interest in my doing it. I think recommended by the Dodger organization, and I think sort of right off the bat, Richard made it clear that he didn't want choreography. Really, I don't think he wanted a choreographer, but that there was one scene on the deck, and as rehearsals progressed, it was true. Sometimes I would show up as one does, and he would say, "Lynne, we're not doing the dance today," and I would say, "Well, I'm just here to watch your back, or however you want to, use me." But he was an opera director, is an opera director, and does a lot of fine productions, and it just was a different way of working. So. I love what I did. I was longing to do a dance for the lower class, but he had a different vision. And, obviously it was a very successful production with some glitches, but it lives on today, and that's pretty remarkable. So proud to be here, proud to be part of it.
And John, how did your audition?
I was working. I was doing How to Succeed, the revival, the first revival across the street with Ted, and it was cast by Hughes Moss Casting, and so I was kind of on their radar. And I had just done a stint as taking over for John Stamos as J. Pierpont Finch, and they came to see that, and they said, "We think we have something for you coming up. What's in your near future?" And I had already booked what was going to be the Broadway revival of Annie with Nell Carter and John Shuck and Sutton Foster as the star to be. And they said, "Well, come in." And so I went in, and fellow How to Succeed castmates Ted and Marty Moran and Vicki Clark all auditioned. I believe we were all there the same day. And then a few days later, we found out that I would not be doing Annie, and that I would indeed get to do Titanic with so many great friends. So it was all because of Hughes Moss Casting.
I had a twisted journey. I'm not known as a performer in this way. Usually people see my back, not my front. but I was supposed to be working on Ragtime in Toronto during the same time that Titanic was happening in New York, but for various reasons, I quit the show. And so I had a whole year ahead of me with nothing planned, which was unusual. And I simultaneously got a call from Janine Tesori, who had been the music director of the workshop of Titanic. And she had to give up Titanic because Violet was being produced for the first time at the same, the same period. And so she said, I think maybe you should music direct Titanic. And I thought, well, I know Maury Yeston. He was a professor of mine in college. So that sounds great. And then I never got the offer for that. And then she called me back. She said, well, it's not going to go your way to be a music director, but they're looking for someone who can play piano and violin and sing. Yeah. And I thought of you, and I think you would really enjoy working with Richard Jones, because I loved working with him on the workshop, she said. So I was actually interested in starting to do some directing myself, and I thought this is a great opportunity to be directed by somebody people admire. And so I called Hughes Moss, who laughed at me at first, and then they started to take me serious, and they said, okay, well, prepare a Ibsen or Shaw monologue in a British accent. And bring something that you can play violin and piano for. So I hastily whipped up a monologue with Vicki Clark's help and sang a Gershwin song during which I played violin in the intervals. What a pity! Isn't it a pity we never met before? So as if we're singing on the sinking ship. And then I had to read John's part. Ultimately, they gave me Lightoller sides to read, we all had a little pact that we would call each other if anybody got a call saying we got the job. And so one day everybody's phone started to ring, and it was a very joyous day.
And Michael, how did you come to be involved?
I had made my Broadway debut in Tommy, and then had gone from that to do Tommy in Germany in the first European company. So I'd been doing that for a long time, and I've always had a kind of complicated relationship with musical theater. I never thought that I was going to be a singing performer. In school, I thought I would be a straight dramatic actor, but I always loved singing and sang in choirs and things, and was trained at Yale because they didn't have they didn't have a real pre-professional program there. So there was no voice and speech training. And I knew that I wanted to do Shakespeare. So I thought, well, I'll just study voice because that will be, useful to do Shakespeare someday. And I studied with a man named Blake Stern, who was a German lieder singer and taught mostly opera students at the graduate school. But he said, I know you're not going to be an opera singer, but I'm going to train you as though that's what you're going to do. And then you can use those skills to do whatever you like. They had really stood me in good stead through Tommy, because I really was not used to singing that much and was not used to singing that high. But I managed, because I'd been trained well, to not hurt myself while I sort of expanded my range and stuff. But at the end of Tommy in Germany, I was determined to come back to New York and resume what I had always meant for my career to be, which was, doing off-Broadway shows and regional theater and, doing Ibsen and Pinter, things that nobody actually did, but they didn't tell me that in college. And so I auditioned for, whatever was available at the time. And the first thing, I didn't get a lot of things, and then the first thing that I actually got some interest from was Titanic, and I felt like, well, this is an entirely different kind of singing than I had been doing in Tommy. So, and it's the kind of singing that I was actually sort of trained for, even though I wasn't planning to do this. So that was appealing, and also the fact that it was working with Richard Jones, who I didn't know at the time, but as I started to hear more about him, I thought, well, this is, in some ways, this is as unlikely a Broadway musical as Tommy was, just in a different context, and as adventurous and as likely to be a disaster as a success as Tommy had been. And so I thought, in a way, this is kind of exactly the kind of thing that I had just loved doing, just a different genre. So I was very excited. And then I started to hear how many people that I knew from college or from other things were involved. And so it just, it seemed, how could I not want to be a part of it?
And Alma, how did this journey begin for you?
I don't know what I was doing at the time. I had an audition, which I remember it felt good. People were comfortable in the room. And then I remember that after I was cast, which took a very long time, the whole process, the Dick Latessa was supposed to be Isidor Strauss, and he booked, funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, the revival that we were doing at the time, and he left that. So I had to sing with about 9 men, some of whom I knew. We sang still, and people watched to see what the best combo would be. And I kept thinking, watch, I'm going to lose it. They're going to find the guy they want. I just remember that it took a very long time, and I got more and more excited, and I remain so to today. I think it's one of the most beautiful shows that exists.
I note, Cerveris, that there's a fan going on behind your head, which I assume means it's hot in Louisiana.
Yeah, exactly.
It's cold in the Berkshires.
Yeah, we represent the opposite ends of the state.
We do. We're balancing, as we did in the show. I couldn't get an audition for Titanic. Hughes Moss said no, he's entirely wrong for it. And I was only in Titanic because of Lynne Taylor-Corbett, who was working with me on Randy Newman's Faust. We had done it at La Jolla, and then we were doing it at the Goodman in Chicago, I believe, when
That's right.
all this was percolating. And she got me through the back door into the room, and I read for Ismay, and Richard Jones thought I was right for it, as opposed to casting people who thought I wasn't. And that was probably the shortest audition process I've ever had. I guess Ismay was the last one through the door. I don't know, Lynn, whether that's true or not.
I think that's of the principles. Yeah.
Anyway, as long as it took for other folks to get cast, I got cast in about 10 minutes, and went on to infamy and being booed at the curtain call every night. It was, I think, a happy journey, in spite of, or maybe because of all the adventures that took place during rehearsal and during previews and so forth and so on. And Cerveris had to live through more than the rest of us, with all the changes involving his character, and that of the late lamented Dr. Ballard, who was part of the journey for a while.
That's right.
But I think it's the only show I've ever been in where nobody in the company wanted to leave. I think we've all been content to stay on that boat for years and years and years. Maybe it was because we were all in the trenches together and had to make all our mistakes in front of all New York before the happy Cinderella ending, because we all went into it knowing what the temptation would be for the critics to write about a sinking ship, and then to have it turn out so magnificently was, I don't think, a joy that any of us will ever be able to duplicate.
And Bill, last but not least.
Well, I did the workshop. Did anyone do the workshop?
No.
No.
So I did the workshop. I don't really remember the audition process for that. I have this vague memory of having to read a classic, like some classic monologue. But you can imagine the process of the workshop as, if you think to our process, remember change. I mean, so we're trying to figure out how to create some of the events of the Titanic. Well, the workshop was filled with crazy things like that, and then I finished the workshop, and I wasn't offered the role. And I thought, well, all right, that happens in show business. Someone with a name, I won't mention that name, was offered the role. And then he turned it down. And so, because he turned it down, they came back to me and gave me the role. And I'd like to think that that as the show proceeded, they sat back there and thought, "What were we thinking?" My God. Anyway, so that was my journey into the show. And like everyone else has said, it was just it's hard to compare that experience with almost anything else. And I'd like to welcome Allan Corduner.
I happened to be in New York and on a vacation, and I heard that Richard Jones, who I knew slightly, was auditioning. So I rang my agent and I said, "I hear Richard Jones is auditioning for an English part in Titanic." And he went, "Oh, it's all cast, it's all cast." And I went, "No, is it? I don't know." So he got in touch with Richard somehow. And the next thing I knew, they wanted to see me, like, to read, but in the theatre, on the stage. So that was the first, and I was leaving in 2 days, back for London, or 3 days. So I went and I read, and I think Brian Darcy James was one of the readers. And all I remember is this little person in the auditorium jumping up and down, going, "Oh, that's fantastic! That's fantastic!" This was Maury. And then I thought nothing of it, and I got on a plane, and I went back to London, and I truthfully, I thought, well, whatever. And then I think 2 days later, the day after I got back home, I got a phone call, actually, not an email, because I think there weren't emails, were there? I think it was pre-email. I don't know. And certainly pre-mine, because I'm a Luddite. And it was Richard going, "Well, do you want to do it?" And I went, "Well, I don't know. I mean, when, and how long?" And it was all very last minute. And then I had to decide whether I wanted to spend what could be a chunk of my life away from home. And it was, well, the best decision I ever made. I got to meet all these wonderful people, and it was an amazing experience. And it's something it's one of the highlights of my life.
Mm. It is wonderful.
My journey with Titanic began when I was quite young. I was actually playing rehearsals for a production of 9 at the Paper Mill Playhouse, and we were doing a run-through, and Maury Yeston sat down on the piano bench with me and sat with me through the entire run-through while I played the show. So that's how I met Maury. And then not too far after, I was about 22 or 23 years old, and they were doing a workshop of Titanic, and that's when I got the call to be involved, kind of as the assistant music director and rehearsal pianist for the original workshop, because it wasn't the whole cast. It was kind of I believe it was 12 actors. All the actors switched parts on a daily basis. It was really just about experimenting with what the show could be, and it was very exciting, and it was really experimental and interesting. And we went through that process for I think it was 4 weeks, and then that was in the fall, I believe, of 1996. And then the show, the Dodgers, decided to bring it to Broadway, and I very happily was asked to be the associate music director for the original Broadway company. And then we started rehearsals, I believe, in January of 97. When we started previews, I would say about 50 to 60% of the music was orchestrated. So I was playing the rest of the show on the piano by myself, which that was a whole other kind of pressure I never had experienced before. So orchestrations were coming in every day. It was thrilling. And we didn't know where we were after the first preview. And then the show in 3.5 weeks gets really heavily worked on, and it wins Best Musical, Best Score, Best Book, Best Orchestrations. It was a very thrilling time.
And Richard Jones's name has come up a lot already, as of course it would, given that he was the director. And what was it like to have someone at the helm of the ship, if you will, that was not a traditional musical theater director, but rather from an opera background?
Lynn, wasn't that the play where he learned to use numbers?
It was encouraging him because there were so many people, and it was moved so quickly at certain points. That to do the chorus line, I think Michael Bennett had developed from 0 to 12 on one side, or 15 or whatever. 18, and then once we did, I think he was sold on it because it's so much easier for people to see a number than say, "Oh, I'm a couple of feet from quarter,"
Yeah.
And I think Richard worked in a different way. I remember he said they didn't really have set breaks. Somebody would just say, "Oh, I think we need a break," and so I think there was a learning curve on all sides, particularly because I was with him so much, but he was. He is a brilliant guy. He's just his own person. I remember on the subway once, he said he had to get off because it was too crowded. He was uncomfortable in large numbers of people. So I think he was comfortable when he was able to be, apart and just work with smaller groups, and was very happy to give over the larger, amount of stuff to other people to sort of block the way he asked or help him block. So it was very different. It was a different role for me as a choreographer in the choreographer-director relationship. It's a learning curve.
I remember learning that before we started rehearsals, because he hadn't really been deeply entrenched in American musical theater before, the producers took him around to see Broadway musicals that were in town to sort of just educate him about the landscape. And that lasted like maybe 1.5 shows, and he was like, "Right, okay, I've seen enough." and I thought that the day there was a moment when he brought us into rehearsal, and we had sort of like been working down one road, and the show was sort of, as we had been, the scripts we had been given initially, and we'd kind of gotten to a point where it wasn't working, but it wasn't quite clear what wasn't working yet. And Richard brought us all together, and he said, "I'm going to tell you this honestly. I've sort of done what I know how to do with the way that I would work on something. And I'm being told by our producers and our creators, our writers, who I trust and believe are brilliant men of the theater, that changes need to be made that I wouldn't have thought to make myself. But I know I trust them enough to listen to them and to make these changes, and they're going to be huge, and they're going to undo a lot of what we've done, and people are going to suddenly have larger roles than they believed they were going to have going into it, and other people are going to have much smaller roles than they were told they were going to have in the beginning. But I'm trusting them and trusting this process and trusting all of you to take this journey. And if anybody doesn't want to, then that's fine, and you can leave with all of our blessings. And it was just the most extraordinary thing. I've never had a director do that, just sort of essentially saying, I know what the artistic avant-garde way of doing this would be, and I can make that piece. I was also asked to deliver a show that can survive in a commercial marketplace and go on tour and do all kinds of things. So I'm going to adopt this new world, and I'm going to try to learn from it. And anyone who wants to come with me, please do. And anyone who doesn't want to, it's fine if you leave. And I've just never had anybody be that kind of transparent and respectful of every person's priority in the whole enterprise.
Yeah, that's my memory too, is that when really priorities about which storylines to follow more closely, that happened in previews.
Yeah.
But I remember my recollection in the rehearsal room was that it wasn't an easy process for Richard or the writers, that it wasn't like a smooth marriage. And they would have a little conference at the end of each day. Maybe you were part of that, Lynn. That was sort of chaperoned by the Dodgers.
Yeah.
Make sure that everybody stayed civil. Changes were discussed. And I think at some point during the rehearsal room process, that's when Richard took a break. And he said, I can't do this right now, at least not the way we've been doing it. And there was a very strange couple of days for us. I think, Lynn, you took over as gracefully as humanly possible. And we kept working. We didn't shut down.
Right.
But
I think what Ted, what was extraordinary, and this could be the stuff of legend, but that there was a lot of disagreement between Maury and Peter about the lifeboats, and that Maury, I believe, if I'm not wrong, literally went home and put that together in almost one night. I mean, it was such a short amount of time, because he didn't ever say, "Oh, I have a musical answer for that," but he was very vocal about it needing something more. And when he came in with that song, and oh my God, it was just a miracle. I mean, I thought it was extraordinary. I don't know how you guys did you come into the room and just learn the whole new scene as a musical experience? I mean, how did that happen for you? I just don't remember that part.
We learned it in the basement of the Luntfontein. We were listening to previews during the whole. Throw out the old.
And they were doing tech stuff on the stage, I think, right?
That's right. Oh my God!
And it went in quite quickly to replace a fairly lengthy back and forth sequence of the lifeboats, and then it was all just condensed in what is now known as To the Lifeboats and Will Meet Tomorrow. I remember vividly rehearsing it in the basement, and it going in a day or two later is my memory of it.
Yeah. I remember that we expected to be doing all kinds of stunts at that point. That we all signed waivers saying that we were willing to go sliding down and jumping, and then we ended up not having to do anything.
Right, so we had to be willing to drop.
More stylized. A very
some of us ended up still doing
getting hit in the shins.
I have a development story quick, which I don't know if everybody knows or anybody knows, but Vicki and I are sitting in the dark, and Maury hadn't figured out how to end the first act. I know it was a problem. And we just cheekily said, "Maury, write us a number. Come on, write us a number." And he looked at us, and his face suddenly went, and he went off and wrote da 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 da, which started with our song and was the theme all the way through the end of the
Amazing.
Oh my God.
I did not know that.
I have an equivalent story, which is that at some point it occurred to me when we were piecing the whole piece together that we had worked the whole first act to establish this little band of 3 musicians. We played numerous times in the first act, and we had a number, and then we didn't appear at all in the second act. And one of the famous things about the Titanic is that the band played on, right?
Yeah.
And this is the musical version of the Titanic, and I thought there's something really off here. And so I started to try to talk to Maury about it, because I knew Maury the best of any of the people on the team. And he literally ran away from me. He ran. He's a fast-moving person, and he ran away from me, and I ran after him. And he ran down into the basement of the Luntfontein, where the pit is and the crew's lockers are. And he thought he could lose me down there, but I knew my way around the basement. And I chased him through nook and cranny of this basement until I cornered him at a dead end. And I said, "You have to deal with this." And so he said, "I don't know what to do, Ted. There's nothing to do." And I said, "You'll figure something out." And then he found a way to write a little tiny violin solo for me that precedes the song Still.
Mm-hmm.
So you got one tiny glimpse of the band as the ship was tilted.
Beautiful.
So that's only there because I fought for it.
And you ran.
I know this is the stuff of how Broadway does it, but of course to me it was all new because I'd never done Broadway before, and I also, to begin with, felt like an intruder because everybody knew each other. Well, not everybody, but I mean, it was a world that I wasn't part of, that I came into, and part of the joy for me of the thing was the people, and even more than the show, was that the people were, I would say, instantly welcoming to me. And I made what I considered, lifelong friends, which is extraordinary because that doesn't happen very often. Especially when you're in another country. So that was one. But the thing, which is huge, but the thing that really astonished me was when we were getting into previews and, the notice board went up for what was being rehearsed the next day. And people's names. And if your name was up there, you knew you were going to be cut. I just remember Judy Blazer going, "My name's up there again." Every day, poor Judy, I really felt for her actually because, she lost one song.
Just two.
She lost two.
Yeah. She was like actually the lead really of the women before we started.
She and Don Stephenson forever are my examples of, gracious ensemble actors.
Yeah.
Because they were specifically told, this is not the gig that you signed up for. And we understand if you would feel like the part is now, not worthy of your time. And they didn't, who knows privately what they felt, but amongst us, they didn't hesitate for a moment, and they were just like, "We're here to be part of the company and contribute however we are asked to." And it's just the most, I'll never forget that, and I'll always admire them for it.
The four millionaires also had their song cut, and that was a very interesting meeting because Richard, it had been decided that it was superfluous, even though it was a terrific song, but there were just too many characters to follow. And Richard did not want to call them. He said to the Dodgers, I think you should call them. And then they would say to, I don't know who the other person was, but, the writers maybe, no, you should call them. And then everybody kind of said to Richard, you really should call them because it'll mean so much more and they'll understand it so much more keenly if it comes from you. And he did. And that was painful, but they were also very graceful about it, as I recall.
Might have been an urban legend, but I think it was, didn't Richard admit at one point that was the song that convinced him to do the show?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Really?
I did.
To all of us, is my memory, in the upstairs lobby of the theater, because he must have called those four guys individually, but then he had to tell the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's right. Group setting, and I think it was then that he told us that this was the song that he liked the most, and the reason that he had signed on, and it was very sad that it had to go.
Very interesting. I don't remember that.
I was playing Mr. Astor and the Other Millionaires. We had an interesting song that ended up on the cutting room floor during previews, which was too bad. It was kind of a great song. The four millionaires are all standing on the deck at a high rate angle of the deck, and the ship is sinking, and they're all singing about the mistakes they'd made in their lives, like little mistakes, just little human errors that they made. And Mr. Astor had a great line. he goes to Etches, and that scene, the whole scene was cut. He says, "Mr. Etches, cancel my appointment at the squash court tomorrow." I found out that he made his money from, his father, I think, made the money from selling beaver skins, beaver fur. Hence the name Astor Square. And you see, if you go to the Astor Square subway station downtown, you will see the motif of beavers in the subway station. And that is what that symbolizes. Yes. But I knew a little bit about him, but not much. Somebody once showed up with a pocket watch that he claimed was the actual pocket watch that was found on Astor's body when his body was recovered from the sinking. And he wanted me to wear it and use it in the show, which I did. And, I did little businesses with it. I was hypnotizing people and I brought it out to look at it in the opening scene. My favorite line, screw up, in all of Titanic history was on the national tour, and I can't remember who did it. The ship is sinking, and the third class, the Irish characters, are in the stairwell. And one of them, the line is supposed to be, Kate, the water's 2 foot deep in the men's dormitory. And the actor came and said, Kate, there's a 2 foot man in the men's dormitory. And then the scene went on.
I'll tell one other little story, because Allan, you were saying the people were such a strong, selling point for you, and absolutely for me too. And I'd done long runs before, a year or so, but always in the pit. And in the pit, you have to be very disciplined and quiet, and you're in view of the audience, especially the conductor. And you can't do anything. You just have to watch the show and then conduct it. And I discovered a whole new world of fooling around, basically. And because in many of the scenes, I wasn't the focus, I was like an anonymous third-class passenger with a strange little beard. In the back of that, we had a lot of fun. And one day, I did my quick change to play Chief Engineer Bell. I had one little scene as the guy in charge of the boiler room, and I had to yell at Brian Darcy James. And I had to just throw on a coat, put on a fake mustache, and grab a clipboard, and then quickly make an entrance right after the opening number. And the clipboard always just had a blank piece of paper on it. One day, the paper was no longer blank, and it had a handwritten MASH note from an anonymous admirer of Chief Engineer Bell's. There was a full-page note just extolling the virtues of Chief Engineer Bell and how this secret admirer will always, hold a special place in his heart. And so it amused me. I had to keep a straight face and yell at Brian. And then I wrote a little reply, and then the next day was a whole new letter. And that became a nightly event. And after a while, other people started writing to Mr. Bell. And it became a whole book of correspondence. And only near when I finally left the show, I found out who the original instigator was, and it was Bill Youmans. It was a fun thing to look forward to every night.
After a year and a half in the show, it's hard not to occasionally crack up on stage. It just happens, And so I taught everyone the laugh cry, which is we mostly were, going down and trying to remember this, John. And it was like if you
oh yeah,
you go just it was immediately making it look like you were going down on a ship. Useful.
I left before. I wasn't the first to leave. I think Becky wasn't she? Becky.
Yeah.
I think I was one of the next anyway. So I left in the January, and I have the poster here with all of your names and autographs. It's wonderful. It's in the office. And Larry Keith, God rest his soul. Every time I look at this, it makes me laugh and sort of cry a little bit, because what he put on it was brilliant. He put "forgotten but not gone." It's so Larry.
I remember they had to completely revamp the whole look of the show. So the logo that's behind Charles's head right now is not what we started with, right?
That's right.
And it's much better.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It was a ship with little
Ship made out of Titanic letters.
Yeah, right.
They changed the whole marquee. Like that had to be an expensive,
Yeah.
That's the story of the show, and what makes it so remarkable. So many changes had to occur to make it successful, and they had to occur in front of everybody because we couldn't take the show out of town.
Yeah.
And to watch these veterans, real craftsmen, and I think craft is something that's underappreciated in creating structure, especially in the musical theater. There's an old saw about if Hitler's alive, I hope he's out of town with a musical. To watch these guys restructure, rewrite, say to us, we know this is a problem, but we can't solve it until next Tuesday, so we're going to do this, and say, it was like watching this erector set being dismantled and reassembled in front of everyone, and making the right decisions. So many of us have seen shows in workshops, in previews, and somehow by the time it gets in front of a paying audience, they've lost the magic. In Titanic, it was just the opposite. Each change incrementally created more magic and more guts, for want of a better word. Including and up to the final change, which was the ending of the show, which came at the night out. Well, wasn't it just in our last?
It was the night we were freezing the show.
Yeah,
which was the day before or something. Yeah,
right before press night.
Yeah.
To see that process and to be a part of it, just unprecedented, I think.
The whole thing, it felt like there was this sense of like, we're the children, and there are these, the director, the producers, there's a lot going on, I feel like, through the whole thing. Because I think as soon as we started rehearsal, my memory is that somebody that was going to be one of the big producers died. I can't really remember the story, but something really bad happened in the beginning. So money had to be gotten quickly, which it was. And then I was always aware that there was a lot of turmoil about what's going to be cut, what's not going to be cut, who's in, who's out. And then, problems with the set. And I just felt like I was like a child over on the side, just like, here I am, I'm doing my job. I love it. But there are a lot of problems, and I hope they figure it out. I think it was my second or third audition. I can't remember. I was like 6 or 7 months pregnant with my daughter, Dora. And at some point I got the offer, and I thought, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I am going to go back to work when she was like this November, December, January, I don't know, about 3 months old. So for me, that was a huge part of that experience. Was my husband made it work. People that helped me with Dora we just somehow made it work so I could go back to rehearsal and, raise this baby. And so that was when I look back, I think, that's a crazy time to go back to work, but that's what happened. And so I was very lucky that we could make that work.
One of the first changes that happened, I don't know that you guys would have ever seen it. You may have, but it was a transition, and it took about a minute and a half or so. And in the transition, Richard and the scenic designer, Stuart, had devised that the Titanic would be shown like this, flat, going across the ocean. You guys don't remember that. It was a little boat.
Side things, yeah.
And you were looking at the top of the boat,
right?
And it was on a string, and maybe the animation wasn't developed enough yet. But what would happen is it would go, and the music would be playing, and it was very beautiful. And then it would get stuck, and the string would get taut, and go like 100 miles an hour. And I remember people bending over. They were laughing so hard. It was just a sight to see. And I think that lasted for about 5 days. And then somebody...
I remember coming into work one day and seeing that whole huge set piece, because it went from like the floor to the flies, that whole thing in a dumpster. As I was walking into work one day, and I was like, yeah, well, that was going to happen sooner or later.
That might be interesting for people who are, maybe we could talk for a second about that initial scenic concept. And I think we should praise, the incredible design by Stewart.
Stewart,
The costumes as well, he did both. And I think even though Richard may have let go of some of the more avant-garde, for lack of a better word, parts of his concept, the scenic design remained in the vision that they started with. And I think it really helped as a counterpoint to what could have felt like a almost overly sentimental telling of the story. The set and the sort of gave it a certain rigor, I thought. But just to say, for people who may not know this history, because Lynne brought it up, I think there must be 5 or 6 moments in the show that had no people involved. There was just supposed to be set moments.
That's right.
Involved models.
The night was alive with the clouds and voices. Alive with the clouds and voices. The skies are turning, the skies are turning, Dear Mother of God, iceberg, right ahead. Thank you. Quartermaster, hard starboard. Hard starboard. The helm's hard over, sir. Engines full astern. Full astern, sir. The bow's connecting, Mr. Miller. 2 degrees to port. The distance, Mr. Fleet, a quarter mile, maybe less. 9 degrees. 10. 11. A full port. Turn. Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Look at the size of it. Looks like the Royal Coast coming. Gibraltar. It's going to pass the starboard, sir. Yes, it's all right. I think we're going to miss it.
The one thing that really remained was the end of the first act, where you just saw the ship going across the back. But there was this bird's eye view from like the beautiful blue sky, seeing happy sailing. There was the breaking of the ship into 2 pieces and it twirling down, right? And then the very last thing was supposed to be Ballard's submarine finding the wreck.
Just baffling audiences nightly.
Didn't you start some of the performances, Michael, as Ballard holding a model of the ship or holding the submarine or something?
No, I started the show as Andrews, but then I would come out and reprise in Every Age.
As Ballard
in a blue jumpsuit and a blue ball cap and sneakers, and the audience who had largely been with us up to that point would then just suddenly like, wait, what? and then after that, you would get the image of the little submersible thing going down and finding the wreckage of the ship on the bottom, and that was the end of the show. Wow. And the audience was just like befuddled.
It booed on a couple of days.
and hostile, yes.
Yeah. Quite the 360 from the top of the show, that great opening sequence, which changed so little from first rehearsal to
brilliant
first preview to opening night.
Yeah.
It's one of the most beautiful openings of any show ever, I think. It's just magnificent. The way it keeps building and building, and you know what's going to happen to the people. And it's just heartbreaking from the get-go, but and the voices just building, and getting to know each character. It's like, I don't know.
It was about 20 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very
So if you're driving in your car and you're listening to Sirius and the Broadway channel, and it says opening number of Titanic, you know you're in for like 20 minutes.
You know, once I was driving up here to our house and listening to Sirius, and that came on, and you guys, I hadn't heard it in a long time, perhaps since our concert, our reunion concert, and I became so emotionally overcome. I literally had to pull over and cry because it was just so overwhelming. It brought back so many amazing memories just hearing that.
I don't think you're ever going to hear a Broadway sound like that again, or a sound like that on Broadway again. That many voices, that many instruments. Going to happen.
I was saying to the kids when we went to go watch their rehearsal that we all got better as singers too, because we were singing so much ensemble stuff in such a vast range that you thought, if I don't hit this note well, somebody's got it. So go for it. And little by little, we were all getting stronger. And I mean, I felt like gained notes by the end of the run.
Yeah.
And did you remember how Peter Stone and John Cunningham would get together to talk about boat terms or ship terms, because when they were working out what was happening to the ship and how would you say this and John Cunningham was a sailor or knew about sailing, and so he had advice about the proper terminology for stuff.
He had a sloop.
That's what he had. Yeah.
And what was it like to deal with during the preview process some of the long pauses that would happen and technical difficulties?
It was a delight.
Sometimes we would get so close and we just would want to just finish it. Can we just so we can't go down, can we just sing to the end? They're all here, it's almost 11 o'clock, and they would say nope, send them home, give them their money back.
And you would feel this sense of unrest until you got to go back the next night and finish the show, because you felt like you had left the theater without doing your job completely.
Yeah.
There were all those headlines in the Post, like the Titanic sinks before leaving port.
Yeah.
And the laugh was on the other side of their face eventually.
I'm afraid we were, largely responsible for Michael Riedel's career.
There was still nothing like that first night, though, because I remember when it didn't go down, we all had to do the curtain call in about 1 foot of space.
Yeah.
That's right.
I will never forget that. All
sidling out.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we did sing the end sometimes before the curtain, didn't we? Didn't we once or twice come out and sing the end of the show?
Yes,
because we just wanted to.
Just had to.
So Charles, I think it would be interesting for people to know that there was a very literally dangerous 30-foot drop to the basement or some, it was a very big drop. And that was safely navigated during the show when it went well, because, this set would come back up as it should have. But the nights that the ship was halfway down, that slot was exposed. So behind the actors was a 30-foot drop. Not sure equity would allow that these days, but it was really a tribute to the spirit of the company that nobody ever gave up. I mean, I think people felt discouraged, but it was an amazing esprit de corps, I think.
This is something that Richard is well known for in England, is actually casting, not just in terms of good people, but in terms of people who get on. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting talent, because obviously with 35 people there's no guarantee, but he's got for someone who's so awkward in company, he has a very good sense of how people are together. Mm-hmm. I think, as a human being, it's happened a lot in his companies here in London.
I think he also leaned on Henry Stram a little bit. Henry had been to the workshop with Bill, and Henry and Richard became very good friends. And I think when it came time to casting the larger group, he asked Henry sometimes, "Who is this person?" And Henry would recommend people like Terry McCarthy, who would not normally have been on Hughes and Moss's radar.
That's right.
Oh, man.
But it worked. Is the point. It was
We all had each other, and it just made it easy, so much easier.
Yeah.
I was just going to say a positive thing in the previews. At least I felt it was one of the most beautiful moments was when the little boy Charlie ran across with the ship, the toy ship. It was just such a beautiful thing, and very much like the way Richard's mind worked. Just an elegant little gesture that lasted 20 seconds, and it was the end of the opening number, right? It was the very last note of the opening number.
It's very funny because when you stage it now, when you don't have a little boy, like I didn't have a little boy at NYU, there's an extra note at the end just for that beat of putting that sailboat in the air. And like, what do I do? Everybody's already done singing, and there's no little boy to come running up with a little boat. And I was tempted to cut that note, in fact, because it's just a repeat of the note before it. But I thought everybody's used to it that way. But there are certain things that were baked into the score because of how Richard staged it.
That's right.
Does anyone remember just a fun Richard story during rehearsal when he ate an entire bag of chocolate coffee beans?
No. I know we started eating
I don't really know what the effect.
Henry brought them.
Take them away. He had to be let off.
Oh,
has anybody stayed in touch with Charlie next year? Do we know what he's up to as an adult?
Robin Irwin, who played his mom, has on the rare occasions I get to catch up with her, she's filled me in, but he's an adult and went to college and is.
I had a project with him backstage because we had some of the same chunks of time off together where we weren't needed on stage. And he was the only kid in the show, and I felt like he could use a little company. And so I bought a book that you take apart, and it becomes, if you work on it hard, it becomes a paper grandfather clock. Made entirely out of paper. And we worked on that for a year together, and we did finish it. We built a paper clock together.
Oh, good for you.
Yes.
Amazing.
And of course, the initial sort of critical reception to the show when it opened wasn't entirely positive. But then there was, of course, the sort of turnaround with the Tonys. And what was that experience like for you? I know
and Rosie O'Donnell.
And Rosie O'Donnell.
The O'Donnell show,
Saved us. Yeah.
And I know you had a story about reading a review backstage right as the show was about to happen.
I had long before this sort of learned not to read reviews, and I went through different phases. For a while, I would have somebody else read them to me because somehow hearing it was not as painful as actually seeing it in print, and then that would be too much, and then I would get people to just kind of give me a synopsis just to roughly, well, they weren't crazy about this, but this was okay. And I had finally gotten to the point where I just would buy them all the papers and just stuff them in a closet, and then like years after, if I even remembered they were there, maybe I would look at them. But we were well into the run now, and I think it was right before the holidays, and we were into the show, and there's a copy of the Village Voice backstage, and I was waiting to go on to do Andrew's Vision, my big 11 o'clock number. And so I'm flipping through it, and there's an article by Michael Feingold with his roundup of the musical soundtrack recordings from that year. And I'm like, well, I mean, it's not really a review, and it's just about a bunch of the albums, and and each one is only like a paragraph. How bad can it be? So I'm reading through, and of course there's Titanic, and I start reading, and it's actually really good, and he's praising the score, and he really loves Maury's writing, and the recording is great. And then I come to the only misfortune that Maury Yeston has is having the big 11 o'clock numbers sung by the gray whiny voice of Michael Cerveris. And as I'm reading those words, I hear the cue for Mr. Andrew's Vision to go on stage, and I'm like, well, if you needed to learn your lesson, you have. And I never wanted the piano to crush me more than that.
Yeah. What was that Rosie O'Donnell experience like? And then the Tonys, of course.
She loved us. She had us on her show twice that I remember, and possibly even more. She was a huge fan of the show. Her talk show was a big hit, and of course, she loves all things Broadway. And she talked about us all the time. And I remember vividly being at the Tonys with us performing at Radio City, and David Costabile and I entered our number from down right, and Rosie was standing right there. And she came up, stood right between us, and said, "You guys are going to win. I know you're going to win." And then literally went on stage, and 20 minutes later or whatever, we'd won. But she was a huge fan. We did get some good reviews. I remember we were sort of a snob hit. Like the New Yorker loved us, the Observer loved us. So discerning folks knew.
Right.
And in terms of the Tony Awards, I remember we were trained all through rehearsal to spend the whole opening number looking up into a void and imagining we were seeing this amazing ship. There was how many stories, 16 stories high, whatever. But there was nothing to look at, really. But when we were finally at Radio City, there's a lot to see when you're on stage there. That hall is magnificent, and it's beautifully lit, even when the audience is sort of dim. It's this astonishing ceiling and balconies. And so for the first time, I felt like, I have something to really sing about. It's out there, I can see.
Were we still backstage in the wing when they did the category, or had we gone back?
They allowed us to stay off stage and not
That's
leave
what I
the
thought.
stage. We were just stage left, I think.
Yeah, that's what I rememred. Yeah.
The Wranglers were kind of pissy about it, but
Right.
they did allow us to stay on stage for the. Well, I guess it was Whoopi Goldberg who actually read the winner.
Yeah.
Remember that it was pouring with rain, and we were all soaked by the time we got in. I mean, walking from the bus.
Yeah.
Stage door, all kind of dripping. Yeah.
Appropriately enough.
Clark Farrell did his club act on the bus tour.
That's right.
I remember another occasion, which was the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Yeah.
Where we also were on a bus, and we parked the bus very close to where the Titanic survivors landed.
Yeah.
The Carpathia.
Yeah.
We did that. And we had to walk with our suitcases almost from the river to Herald Square at dawn, basically, to do rehearsal in our costumes. It felt like the survivors were actually making their way to Macy's.
Well, and when I left for a while to do Hedwig downtown at the Jane Street Theater, and I remember trying to remember which accent to have in which place, but also the Jane Hotel was where they had brought the survivors. The dressing room the room that they used for us to dress in at the top corner, this sort of turret thing, was the space that they had used as a chapel the next morning in a little service for the survivors. So it was so surreal to be in that. And I think there was an element of that for all of us throughout, that, we were reenacting this actual event that had happened to real people, and that this city had, a real personal connection to.
Speaking of which, I in the Theatre de l'Enfantin, I was told they had the same chandeliers stylistically that were on the Titanic, because it was around the same year.
Wow.
Every night at the curtain call, the number of people that you saw, about 1,500.
Remember that died.
So how many people went down? It hit me quite a bit to see that many people in one group and see how much that was.
My job was to figure out how do I portray the whole spread of massive spread and width of class structure in English society generally, from the lowest servant, a bootblack who shines your shoes, to the King of England, and we had all of that on the ship, and then of course. What I realized was, because I always, when I'm writing a show, somewhere along the line, I wonder, okay, who am I? And I realize, okay, I know who I am. Maybe I'm supposed to be the first class because the third class because I'm an immigrant, right? So I'd be down there in the hall along with the rest of the Jewish people trying to get away from Europe. But at the same time, I'm a middle class man, and of course, the Titanic was a ship that had three distinct classes. There's the landed gentry, the old social leaders, right? The first class. And then, of course, the immigrants. But the people in the middle are the rising business class of the middle class who would become what the world is now, which is, basically middle class. And so any American looking at the Titanic, like me, is going to identify with the middle class.
And to what extent did all of you do research into the actual event in your process of figuring out your roles?
Endless.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the remarkable things about the story is it's not just the story, but all the attendant parts of the story, and then the 1,500 people attached to the story, and on and on. I mean, it's a never-ending. What is like stacking dolls? You can keep deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
And I think we all felt, at least I did, a responsibility to the actual people. And certainly Ismay was a very complicated man. But the more I dug into him, not only did the piece itself become richer, but the things you could find to play every night, which is always a challenge in a long run. So I kept reading about him as we were doing the show. Months in, I'd find another book, and I'd find another little morsel, and different ways to keep the blame from going off track. Every night, Cerveris and I were, you get into that, the mode of a long run where your mind starts to drift, and in a song like that, that's death. So the fact that there was so much archival material to dig into kept the show at least fresh for me as we went along, because there's always new things to find.
Particularly for those of us who played people who survived the sinking, there was, like Lightoller survived, Ismay survives, there was certainly more info to search for and find than sadly the people who perished.
I have a friend, Meek Thayer, who's her great something was the Thayer, one of the Thayer, and he said that the two children that were with the Thayers, or one of the sons was with his wife, I forget exactly, but that the son had trained to swim like crazy in prep school. They were the Thayers, so so it was sort of the opposite of what happened to Leonard, to the stars of the movie, Titanic. It's like if only he had learned how to swim, he might have survived. He was such a good swimmer that his girlfriend or wife or sister didn't make it, and he in fact did. Was a good swimmer to get to a lifeboat. Anyway.
I remember I went to England and I looked around. Ireland. I talked to people at Harlan Wolff. I went to the Titanic Historical Society, who were very skeptical at first when I started explaining, what I was doing, and a musical about the sinking of the Titanic does not seem appropriate at all. But I think I convinced them by my earnestness of wanting to, know anything that they could share with me or show to me, that we were, taking it seriously and respectfully. But it's also, there were so many fascinating things that you could learn for your own character, but there was so much as the enduring fascination with the Titanic proves. There's so much about that ship and that time and that event and all the things that it meant that are so fascinating. And you can, like David was saying, you can explore endlessly varieties of things and the kinds of cutlery that they had, and all of that is just a goldmine for actors trying to root themselves in a place.
Go ahead.
where these incredibly famous paintings were on the ship, which of course they couldn't have been. Do you remember in the movie? famous works of art.
Do you also recall that when the movie came out, people would come to the box office and ask if Leonardo DiCaprio was in the show that night?
Yeah. It kind of helped us in the long run, because it was originally, the movie was supposed to have come out like around the time we opened, which probably would have been a disaster, but instead it opened in the fall when things were maybe, our initial energy was maybe subsiding a little bit, and then suddenly everybody was excited about the Titanic again, so it was actually a great thing for us.
Yeah.
You guys remember, go ahead. I was going to say,
go ahead.
he was asking about positive things that happened in previews. And I remember there was so much talk about the messenger, like how were we going to tell the audience that the people on the boat finally realized what was going on. And it was the tea cart. Remember?
Right.
It was the tea cart moving by itself, which was so chilling. Yes. But I remember the ideas in the meetings that were so-and-so would tell so-and-so, and then they'd accidentally blurt it out, or, that I thought that was one of the most interesting solutions. And I'm not sure whose idea it ultimately was, but it said more than words could have said. Just that moment of the slow, realization, and you kind of watched it in real time. It was so visceral. It was amazing.
And Alan's very British watching it, I think, also told us a little bit of story.
That's right.
It's actually in the movie, A Night to Remember, there's something similar.
Is it?
So probably in someone's deep memory, it was living there.
Mm.
When I just did it at NYU, our prop guy was like so excited to build something that could do this. But then at a certain point, I wasn't sure it was actually going to happen because we couldn't find an existing tea cart for him to modify that we could afford and get.
We did it with a little boy in it.
And so I had to think of what else could we do if we can't do the tea cart. And I saw there was this quite well received smaller production that toured the UK that you can now watch on Netflix. And they just did a brownout. There was just the moment where like just all the electricity just sort of and so everybody just looked around and they realized it was more serious than they thought, and that worked too. So it's interesting. There's
interesting. Yeah,
we did a little production that Don Stephenson directed at the hangar, and we put a little boy in it, and he was actually driving underneath.
Oh wow!
He got kind of confused one day, and the car starts moving. It was kind of sad, but he was all right. Oh my God.
We ultimately did have one, and it was an automated skateboard, basically, on the bottom of a car that we built. But skateboards are, those ones are built to go really fast. It was very hard to control it so that it looked like it was just gradually starting, because it didn't look like it was zooming across the stage, which sort of ruined the whole effect.
And for those of you who did stay in the original production until its closing night, what was that experience like of sort of seeing the show out to its finish?
It was surprising that we were closing. I think to those of us that got the announcement, that I don't think we thought we were going to close. We weren't doing that badly, and the tour was going out. I don't remember the actual last performance. Do you? I don't remember the last performance. I remember the sadness of hearing we were going to close. And thinking,
I remember the original cast being invited back. Cerveris and I climbed up that ramp again.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole gang. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then getting to do that thing at the Philharmonic was kind of beautiful.
Yeah. The videos of us all seeing each other and singing that for the first time again, just floods of tears.
Floods. Do you remember? I was wearing a suede jacket, and it's been permanently stained ever since.
I just had to counterbalance that with the memory of touching bums with Alan in our tiny little dressing room. Every time there was no room to turn around. I mean, a cast of 37 and huge orchestra. in these old theaters, especially with all the automation and everything that gets put in, left very little room for us. It's another testament to our ensemble that we existed so happily in those tight quarters.
And your doggy.
And yes, and Gibson.
Gibson.
Yeah, and Alma's dogs as well.
My dog and Piper.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Going up and down collecting socks.
Gibson licked my bum.
Yeah.
All right, this is a family show. Cut it out. Anybody remember the firefighters coming one night?
Yeah.
That was very exciting.
Yeah.
The girls were all a tizzy, and many of the boys
come?
Yeah, some alarm went off, right?
I think it was a mandatory inspection. So they came with their entire outfits on and their hatchets, and it was quite extraordinary.
And in terms of people visiting the show and seeing the show, I wonder if there was anyone who was a descendant of a survivor of the Titanic, or people who had personal connections like that.
Well, like I said, that's been me there, but I'm sure there were others, right? That
People stopped at the stage door once and said they were relatives of Charles Lightoller, and they were like and cousins once removed. And I was so thrilled they were there, and it was just after performance number 622, and I remember that being a big lesson for me. Like, you never know who's in the
audience. There was a night I told you that there were over 200 Strauss family in the audience one night.
Oh my gosh!
Just descendants, because Strauss with one S. Apparently, there's a lot of them, and there are a lot of philanthropists and stuff. And it was lovely. We got to meet a lot of them, but they were just descendants, and they loved it, or at least they said they did. So that's good.
So, I got asked to direct it at the Muni, the big mothership version of it, and I went and did that with Kevin. Stites was the music director, and Liza Gennaro was the choreographer, and she and I were old friends, and we'd done lots of shows together. And when we were sitting there, I think lunch one day, we all started talking about, isn't it too bad that the show is so big? It takes such a huge orchestra and such a huge cast. It makes it undoable almost for a lot of theaters. Most theaters, they don't have the resources to do it. And so my thinking was, I love the show and I wish it could be done more. How else could you do it? So with just that little kernel of an idea, I started thinking, well, do you really need that? Well, what if you did it this way? Well, what if you didn't have that? How else could you do it? Well, what if you didn't have that person? Well, what if that person played that part? Well, what if they played that part and that part? What if the deck didn't tilt, but you could make it look as if it tilted? How would I do the lifeboat scene with fewer people, but still make it look crowded? So all of those problems I started thinking about, never really with the idea that I could solve them. And the advantage I had was that I knew the original so well. I had done, almost the entire run, first playing Charles, and then I played Harold Bride once Marty left. I knew it, and I had heard it. So I knew all of the lines, and I knew all of the songs. And when you have something like that in your head, I don't know, there's a familiarity with it. And I also had all of the stuff that had been cut. So I went back to my original script, which I had kept, and I had lines and things that Peter had just said to me and that I had written in pencil. And so I was looking at all the different versions of a single line and the ones that what if you said this? Well, what if it was this? What if it was that, Don? And then I picked. So I had all of this older material, and I started reconfiguring and reassigning, and the idea was to come up with a version that could be done by more theaters with a smaller budget. And I had the idea of, what if the sound of it was if the show is being played by the ship's band and not this huge orchestra? What if it was Wallace Hartley and his band was playing the show? And I thought that what it could do was it could iris in on the characters more and make it more intimate. And one of the criticisms I think of the original show was that it was so large and lush, and that it didn't focus on the characters enough. And I thought, well, I could do that. I can focus it in more on the characters and not have all of the stuff that you see, but almost doing the show like in a close-up. So that was my idea, and most of it was just out of sheer desperation about how to do things. How do you do the opening number when you don't have that many people? How do you still make it thrilling, and how do you not make it silly? Because obviously it's Titanic and it's supposed to be big and there's lots of people on the ship. How else can you do it? So that was the idea, and I loved working on it. And suddenly when I actually got the production, I took it to everyone, and everyone said no. Everyone said, no. Well, I love Titanic, but no. And finally, Peter Flynn at the Hangar Theater said yes. And then I was like, oh, well, now I really do have to know how to do it. Oh, no. So I remember lying awake at night, trying to figure out a way to do certain things. I mean, obviously stuff like two-person scenes are easy. That's not hard. But the stuff that was not as easy. So, I came up with other ways of like using one character to be all of the millionaire wives, and and I watched all those hours of Nicholas Nickleby and the RSC's production to see how they had done ingenious ways to make actors play more than one part. And so I did all of this research, and I went to Maury, and I remember we sat in his apartment on the floor. And he's so brilliant. His mind is almost like a computer. And I was like, okay, what if I have this amount of people here for this section? He was like, dun, 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 dun. Yeah, okay, you can do that. Make sure that they sing this line here. And he was like, yeah, go do it. Go try it. Mm-hmm. And when he came and saw it, I think he loved it. And so that version is now licensed. I mean, look, I love the original. Obviously, I was in it, and I think it's great. But I think the other version, the chamber version, the tiny Titanic, we used to call it as a joke, allows people to do it. More theaters to do it. And I think that may ultimately be the version that's done the most, because you can afford it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this. And I wonder if, just before we go, as sort of a closing final thing, if what sort of advice would you give to people doing Titanic now, since it is a show that's become so beloved and gets done so much?
I think the research that you do will fill you a great deal, and but probably more important than anything is, as I think you can tell from all of us, is the connection with everyone else, and the more of an ensemble and a genuine supportive environment of equals that you can create, the happier an experience it's going to be, I think.
That's right. Beautiful.
Fortune's friends.